Imagine opening a bakery and without asking, getting a regular who shows up like clockwork. Too handsome, too confident, and clearly addicted to sugar, and to teasing her. She tries to shut down his ego with razor-sharp comebacks. He fires back with charm and dry humor. It sounds simple, customer and baker, except the chemistry starts seeping into the routine like a song you swear you hate, but keep humming anyway. The bakery had been open for exactly 5 days when the trouble walked in wearing a tailored dark suit. Brianna Palmer was behind the counter, finishing the frosting on a 3-tier cake, her first big custom order, the kind that could put Sweet Crumb on the map. Her piping bag moved with surgical precision, each swirl of buttercream landing exactly where it belonged. The scent of vanilla and toasted sugar hung warm in the air, mixing with the faint hum of the oven timer, counting down in the back. She was murmuring to herself, the way she always did when concentration took over, little whispered commands like, "Steady," and "Don't you dare," aimed at her own hands. Then she looked up, and there he was, standing in the doorway like he'd been placed there by a casting director, tall, broad-shouldered, jawline sharp enough to cut glass, and eyes so dark they seemed to read the entire room in 2 seconds flat. He wore his suit the way some men wear armor, perfectly fitted, not a wrinkle in sight, as though the fabric had been personally intimidated into behaving. Brianna's hand froze, then trembled. A thick, jagged line of buttercream slid across the second tier of her cake like a scar. He noticed. Of course he noticed. Jack Clark walked to the counter with the kind of unhurried confidence that suggested the world generally rearranged itself around him. He glanced at the cake, then at her face, flushed pink from the jawline up, and let one corner of his mouth lift into a slow, knowing smile. "Does that always happen when a customer walks in?" he said. "Or should I feel special?" Brianna's stomach dropped, then her spine straightened. She set the piping bag down with deliberate calm, wiped her hands on her apron, and met his gaze with every ounce of dignity she could gather. "It happens every time someone walks in unannounced and interrupts my work. Don't flatter yourself." He laughed, a real laugh, low and warm, the kind that vibrated through the small space and settled somewhere behind her ribs without permission. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to throw the piping bag at his perfect face. Instead, she turned back to the ruined buttercream line and began repairing it with hands that absolutely, definitely were not still shaking. If this story is touching your heart, show your support. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. Every action helps us keep bringing you new stories full of emotion. Jack ordered a coffee and a slice of whatever she recommended. She handed him a piece of lemon pound cake without looking up. He took a bite, paused, and said nothing for a long moment. She stole a glance. His eyes had gone slightly unfocused, the way people look when something catches them off guard in a good way. "This is incredible," he said, simply. No teasing, no performance. She blinked. "Thank you." He finished the slice in silence, left a generous tip, and walked out. Through the glass front of the bakery, she watched him cross the street and disappear into the steel and glass building directly opposite. Clark and Mitchell Construction, the sign read in bold, clean letters. Of course, he worked right across the street. Brianna pressed her palms flat on the counter, exhaled through her nose and stared at the damaged cake. The buttercream scar was fixed now, invisible to anyone who hadn't witnessed the crime. But she knew it was there, and she knew exactly who had caused it. She bit her lower lip, a habit she'd carried since childhood, the one that surfaced whenever she was nervous or annoyed or trying very hard not to feel something she didn't want to feel. Across the street, Jack stepped into the elevator of his building and caught his reflection in the polished metal doors. He straightened his tie, adjusted the collar, ran one hand through his dark hair in that automatic way he'd done 10,000 times before. But his mind wasn't on the mirror. It was on the flour dusted across her cheekbone, the way her green eyes had flared when she'd fired back at him, sharp and bright like a match strike, the quiet pride in her posture when she'd turned away, refusing to give him another second of her attention. He'd walked into that bakery because he had 15 minutes before a meeting, and the place was new. He'd expected average pastries and forgettable small talk. What he had not expected was a woman who smelled like vanilla and spoke to him like he was an inconvenience she hadn't budgeted for. The elevator opened. His business partner, Drew Mitchell, was leaning against the reception desk, scrolling through his phone. "You're smiling," Drew said without looking up. "That's either very good news about the Whitmore contract or very bad news for everyone around you. "New bakery across the street," Jack said, walking past him. "The lemon cake is outstanding." Drew finally looked up. "You hate lemon cake?" Jack didn't answer. He walked into his office, shut the door and stood by the window. From the 7th floor, he could see directly into the front of Sweet Crumb, a small figure behind the counter, moving with focused grace, repairing what he'd disrupted. He watched for exactly 4 seconds longer than a man who didn't care would have watched. Then he sat down, opened his laptop, and told himself it was just cake. But somewhere beneath the tailored suit and the practiced composure, Jack Clark had the strange, unsettling feeling that his mornings had just become significantly more complicated. And across the street, Brianna Palmer stared at the finished cake and whispered to herself, "Don't you dare come back tomorrow." She already knew he would. Here's something nobody tells you about enemies. They keep showing up. By the 3rd day, Jack Clark had a routine. 8:15 in the morning, cheese bread and a black espresso. 1:12 in the afternoon, something sweet, whatever she'd made fresh that day. And if the afternoon dragged, which it always seemed to now, he'd be back around 4 for coffee and a slice of cake. 3 visits, every single day. Like clockwork in an expensive suit. Brianna noticed, obviously. She noticed because it was impossible not to. The way the bell above the door chimed, and she already knew before looking up exactly who it was. She noticed because her hands did a tiny, involuntary thing every time, a micro pause in whatever she was doing, just long enough to be embarrassing if anyone were paying close attention. Someone was paying close attention. "You know," she said on day 4, sliding his espresso across the counter, "most investors at least own shares before they show up 3 times a day." Jack picked up the cup, took a slow sip, and didn't break eye contact. "I'm not an investor. I'm quality control. Quality control doesn't usually check his reflection in my display case." He glanced at the glass pastry case beside him, caught his own reflection and, without a shred of shame, adjusted a strand of hair near his temple. "The display case serves 2 purposes now. You should be thanking me for increasing its value." Brianna's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowed, and somewhere deep behind her ribs, in a place she refused to acknowledge, something flickered warm. "The case is for displaying pastries," she said, each word precise. "Not egos." He smiled wider. She ground her teeth. And the morning continued exactly as every morning had begun to continue, with the 2 of them circling each other in a dance neither one of them had agreed to learn. The supporting cast arrived on cue. Drew Mitchell discovered Sweet Crumb on a Tuesday, not because he wanted pastries, but because he wanted answers. He'd noticed his business partner leaving the office 3 times a day. He'd noticed the distracted look during the Whitmore contract review. He'd noticed Jack straightening his tie before crossing the street, which was new because Jack straightened his tie for clients, not for coffee. So Drew walked in, ordered a cinnamon roll, and within 90 seconds understood everything. "Oh," he said, watching Jack lean against the counter and say something that made Brianna roll her eyes so hard it was practically aerobic. "Oh, this is fantastic." He sat at a corner table, ate his cinnamon roll, which was admittedly the best thing he'd ever tasted, and watched his best friend make an absolute fool of himself with the calm, delighted focus of a man watching his favorite television show. When Jack returned to the office, Drew was already there, feet on the desk, grinning. "So," Drew said, "the baker." "The lemon cake," Jack corrected. "You hate lemon cake." "I've evolved." Drew laughed so hard he nearly fell out of his chair. On the other side of the street, Brianna had her own audience. Megan Walsh had been Brianna's best friend since college. The kind of friend who would show up at 2 in the morning with ice cream and a speech, who cried at commercials and planned other people's weddings as a hobby. She was dramatic the way weather is dramatic, loudly, unapologetically, and with very little warning. Megan met Jack on her 3rd visit to the bakery. He walked in, said something about the croissants looking nearly as good as he did, and walked out with a coffee and the satisfied expression of a man who'd won a round. Megan stared at the door, then at Brianna, then back at the door. "Who?" she said slowly. "Was that?" "A customer." "That was not a customer. That was a movie trailer in a suit. Brianna. Brianna. He looked at you like you were the last slice of cake on earth. He looked at me like he looks at everything, like he owns the room." "Exactly. And you looked at him like you wanted to throw frosting at his face, which is basically the same thing as flirting for you." Brianna pointed a spatula at her. I don't flirt. You flirt like porcupines hug, aggressively and with great personal risk. Despite herself, Brianna laughed. It escaped before she could catch it, a bright, unguarded sound that made her clap a hand over her mouth. I knew it, Megan whispered, eyes wide with delight. You like him. I absolutely do not. You're biting your lip right now. Brianna released her lower lip so fast it was almost comical. Megan clasped both hands together like she was witnessing a miracle. I'm going to plan the wedding. Outdoor ceremony. Sunflowers. You'll have a cake tower instead of a regular cake. Megan. He is an arrogant, vain, insufferable man who thinks the world revolves around his jawline. Yes, and you've memorized his jawline. Tell me more about how much you don't care. Brianna turned back to her mixing bowl with the exaggerated focus of someone diffusing a bomb, whisking batter with more force than strictly necessary. But later that night, after she'd locked the bakery and turned off the lights, she stood for a moment by the front window. The construction company across the street was dark, except for one office on the 7th floor, where a single desk lamp glowed behind the glass. She didn't know that he was sitting at that desk, staring at a contract he'd read 3 times without absorbing a single word, because his mind kept circling back to the way she wrinkled her nose when a pastry didn't meet her standards. She didn't know that he'd started keeping a mental catalogue of her expressions, the focused furrow, the exasperated eye roll, the surprised laugh she always tried to catch before it fully escaped. She didn't know any of that. All she knew was that the light was on, and that for reasons she absolutely was not going to examine, it made her feel less alone. She locked the door, pulled her coat tighter against the cool evening air, and walked home. And across the street, Jack Clark turned off his desk lamp, looked down at Sweet Crumb's darkened storefront and thought, tomorrow, maybe he'd try the chocolate cake. He already knew it wasn't about the chocolate cake. There are moments in life when pride writes a check the body absolutely cannot cash. For Jack Clark, that moment arrived on a Wednesday, right between his morning cheese bread and his espresso. It had been almost 2 weeks of the same routine. 2 weeks of provocations traded across the counter like currency, each one sharper than the last. 2 weeks of Brianna cataloguing every single time he checked his reflection, in the display case, in the window, in the back of a spoon, once even in the surface of his own coffee before taking a sip. She'd started keeping a mental tally. It was reaching absurd numbers. 7, she said that morning, setting down his espresso. He looked up. 7 what? Times you've checked your reflection since you walked in, and you've been here 4 minutes. Jack leaned back, folded his arms, and did not, to his credit, glance at the display case. That's an exaggeration. I counted. You adjusted your hair twice in the window before opening the door. Once in the glass of the pastry case. Twice in your phone screen. Once in the espresso machine. And just now you tilted your coffee cup to check your teeth. From the corner table, Drew snorted into his cinnamon roll. Jack's jaw tightened, but the amusement in his eyes betrayed him. I call that self-awareness. It's a virtue. It's a condition. Brianna crossed her arms, mirroring his posture without realizing it. I bet you can't go a single day without doing it. Not one. The air between them shifted. Drew looked up from his plate. Megan, who had arrived 3 minutes ago and was pretending to read a magazine, lowered it an inch. A bet, Jack repeated slowly. 1 full day, no vain comments about yourself, no checking reflections, no adjusting your hair, your tie, your collar, nothing. Sunrise to sunset. And if I win? She hadn't expected him to engage this fast. She swallowed, recovered. If you win, I create a signature dessert with your name on the menu, permanently. Something sparked in his eyes. Interest. Challenge. Something else she chose not to name. And if I lose? Now she smiled. The kind of smile that made his chest do something inconvenient. You work a full Saturday shift here, behind the counter, in an apron. Drew made a sound that was half gasp, half laugh. Megan gripped her magazine so hard it crinkled. Jack stared at Brianna. She stared back. Her chin was lifted, her green eyes bright with challenge, and she was biting her lower lip. Not from nerves this time, but from the sheer pleasure of having cornered him. He extended his hand across the counter. Deal. Her hand was smaller than his, warm from the oven, dusted with flour at the wrist. The handshake lasted exactly 1 second longer than a handshake between 2 people who don't affect each other. She pulled away first. He let her. The next morning, Jack walked into his office building with the focus of a man entering battle. No reflective surfaces, no adjustments. He'd dressed carefully at home, one final thorough mirror check, and then covered the bathroom mirror with a towel like a man trying to quit a vice. He made it through the morning meeting. He survived a conference call without touching his tie. He walked past the elevator doors with their polished steel reflection and kept his eyes fixed forward, fists at his sides, jaw set. At 11:42, he stepped into the elevator alone. The doors closed. The silence hummed, and without thinking, the way a hand reaches for a light switch in the dark, he glanced down, caught his reflection in the brushed metal panel, and straightened his tie with one precise, practiced motion. He realized what he'd done approximately half a second later. "No," he whispered. But it was too late, because standing behind him, having slipped into the elevator just before the doors closed, was Nina Reeves, his assistant. She had her phone in her hand, one eyebrow raised to her hairline, and the expression of someone who had just witnessed a confession. That, Nina said calmly, was a tie adjustment accompanied by a full visual self-check at 11:42 a.m. Jack closed his eyes. "Nina, I'll be texting this information to the bakery immediately. Nina, please. Should I include a timestamp, or is the betrayal sufficient on its own?" He turned to face her. She was already typing. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. Nina walked out with the serene composure of someone delivering justice, her heels clicking against the marble floor. The news reached Sweet Crumb before Jack did. When he walked in at 4:15 for his afternoon coffee, Brianna was waiting, leaning against the counter, arms crossed, wearing a smile so triumphant it practically glowed. Behind her, hanging from a hook on the wall, clearly prepared in advance because she had clearly expected this outcome, was an apron, powder pink, embroidered with the Sweet Crumb logo. "Welcome to your new Saturday job," she said. Jack stopped in the doorway. He looked at the apron. He looked at her. He looked at the apron again. "That's pink," he said. "It matches your personality." Drew, who had apparently followed him across the street for the express purpose of witnessing this moment, collapsed into a chair and laughed until tears streamed down his face. Jack stood there in the doorway of that small bakery that smelled like cinnamon and warm bread, looking at a woman who had just publicly defeated him, and felt something crack open in his chest. Not pain. Something worse. Something warm and terrifying and completely beyond his control. He walked to the counter, picked up the apron and held it against his chest with exaggerated dignity. "Saturday," he said. "What time do you open?" 6 a.m., she said sweetly. He winced. She grinned. And somewhere in the back of the bakery, Megan whispered to Drew, "We're going to need a bigger table. This is better than any show I've ever watched." For once, Drew agreed with someone he'd just met. And across the street, watching from his usual post by the building entrance, an older gentleman named Harold, the doorman who had worked that block for 19 years and had seen every kind of human foolishness, shook his head with a quiet smile and muttered to himself, "That boy doesn't stand a chance." He was right. Jack didn't stand a chance. He just didn't know it yet. Some things you can prepare for. A board meeting, a contract negotiation, a cross-examination from a difficult client. Jack Clark had spent his career preparing for high-stakes moments with the calm precision of a man who understood that control was everything. Nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for a Saturday in a pink apron. He arrived at 5:58, 2 minutes early, because despite everything, Jack Clark was never late. He stood outside Sweet Crumb in the grey morning light, wearing jeans and a simple white t-shirt, and stared at his reflection in the bakery window. Then caught himself, cursed under his breath and pushed the door open. Brianna was already inside. Of course she was. She'd probably been there since 4, because the air was thick with the scent of fresh bread and melted butter and something darker and richer. Chocolate ganache, maybe, still warm on the stove. The kitchen radio was playing something soft and old, and she was humming along, moving between the oven and the counter with the practiced rhythm of someone completely in her element. She turned when the bell chimed, and stopped. He was in jeans, a plain white t-shirt that fit him in a way that should probably be regulated by some kind of authority. No suit, no tie, no armor, just him, tall and broad and slightly uncertain in a way she had never seen before. Brianna's hand, which was holding a tray of fresh croissants, went dangerously unsteady. She recovered by gripping the tray harder and setting it down with exaggerated care. "Oh, you're early," she said, and her voice came out a half note higher than intended. "I'm always early." He looked around the kitchen, the organized chaos of flour-dusted surfaces, the piping bags lined up like soldiers, the chalkboard menu she'd written in her neat, curving handwriting. "Where's the apron?" She pointed to the hook by the door. He tied it on with more dignity than any human being had ever given a powder-pink apron. When he turned around, she bit the inside of her cheek to keep from smiling. "Okay," he said, spreading his hands. "Put me to work." The first 2 hours were a disaster in the most entertaining way possible. Jack confused a cappuccino order with a latte, handed a customer a blueberry muffin instead of a bran muffin, and nearly dropped a lemon tart that Brianna had spent 40 minutes perfecting. She caught the tart with reflexes born from years of kitchen emergencies, pressed it safely onto the counter, and turned to him with an expression that hovered between fury and disbelief. "That," she said, pointing at the tart, "took me 40 minutes. It's fine, I had it under control. You were holding it with one hand, Jack. I have very capable hands." She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again, and finally just shook her head and walked away. From the corner table, because of course she was there, Megan raised her coffee cup in a silent toast to the chaos. But somewhere around mid-morning, something shifted. It happened gradually, the way weather changes. Jack stopped trying to be charming and started actually trying. He watched how Brianna greeted the regulars, remembering names, asking about grandchildren, knowing who wanted extra foam and who didn't. He tried to replicate it, awkwardly at first, then with growing sincerity. An elderly woman told him her lemon cake was for her book club, and he asked what they were reading. She beamed. He boxed the cake carefully, with both hands, and carried it to the door for her. Brianna watched this from behind the espresso machine. She watched his careful, clumsy tenderness, with a customer he had no reason to impress. She watched the way he listened, really listened, when someone spoke to him without a contract on the table. And something inside her chest shifted like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known existed. Early afternoon. The lunch rush had cleared. Brianna stood at the decorating station, piping delicate rosettes onto a row of cupcakes. She was in the zone, murmuring to herself, nose wrinkled in concentration, the piping bag moving in tiny controlled circles. Jack approached from behind to ask where she kept the extra napkins. He leaned in, and his voice came from just over her shoulder, close, much closer than he'd calculated. "Hey, where do you keep the—" He stopped, because his arm had brushed against hers, bare skin against bare skin, his forearm against the soft inside of her wrist. A small touch, barely anything. The kind of contact that happens 1,000 times a day between strangers on a subway without anyone noticing. But this was not a subway, and they were not strangers. Brianna went very still. The piping bag hovered motionless above a cupcake. She could feel the warmth of him behind her, the solid nearness of his chest, the faint scent of his cologne mixed with flour and sugar, because he smelled like her bakery now, and that thought did something reckless to her pulse. Jack didn't move. He could smell her shampoo, something clean and sweet, like coconut and honey. He could see the tiny flour smudge on her neck, just below her ear. He could feel the heat of her skin where their arms touched, and every rational thought in his head evaporated like steam. 3 seconds passed, maybe 4. Neither of them breathed. Then he stepped back, slowly, deliberately, cleared his throat. "Napkins," he said, and his voice sounded like he'd swallowed gravel. "Second shelf," she whispered. "Behind the sugar." He nodded once and walked away. She exhaled so hard, the cupcake rosette wobbled. From the corner table, Megan had frozen with her coffee cup halfway to her lips. Her eyes were enormous. She looked at Brianna. She looked at Jack's retreating back. She looked down at her cup. Then she set it down very carefully, pulled out her phone, and typed a message to no one in particular that simply read, "It is happening." The rest of the afternoon passed in a strange, electric quiet. They moved around each other with new awareness, a wider berth when passing in the narrow kitchen, a careful avoidance of eye contact that was, somehow, more intimate than any stare. Jack finished his shift at closing time, hung up the pink apron with surprising gentleness, and stood by the door. "Same time next Saturday?" he asked. He meant it as a joke. His voice didn't quite land it. You only owed one Saturday, she said, wiping down the counter without looking up. I know. A pause. She stopped wiping. He stood in the doorway, backlit by the evening streetlights. The cupcakes you decorated this morning, she said. The rosettes were uneven. He smiled. I'll practice. She finally looked up, and for one breath, the masks were off. No teasing, no armor, no clever comebacks. Just two people standing in a bakery that smelled like sugar and possibility, feeling the full, terrifying weight of something neither one of them had planned. Good night, Jack. Good night, Brianna. He walked out. She locked the door, and both of them stood on opposite sides of the glass just for a moment before turning away. The distance between them had never felt smaller or more dangerous. Nobody warned Brianna Palmer that the Neighborhood Business Association had the power to ruin her peace of mind. But that's exactly what happened on a Tuesday morning, when a cheerful woman in a blazer walked into Sweet Crumb, handed her a flyer, and casually detonated a bomb. The annual Harrington Street Food Festival, the woman announced, tapping the flyer with a manicured finger. Every business on the block participates. This year we're pairing establishments together for collaborative booths. Creates community. Encourages cross-promotion. Your bakery has been matched with Clark & Mitchell Construction. Brianna stared at the flyer, then at the woman, then back at the flyer. I'm sorry. Matched. Paired. Partnered. You'll share a booth. Plan a joint concept. Build something fun together. The festival is in 3 weeks. Planning meetings start this week. The woman smiled with the serene confidence of someone who had no idea what she'd just done. It's going to be wonderful. She left. Brianna stood behind her counter, holding the flyer like it was a court summons. Across the street, Jack received the same news from Drew, who delivered it while eating a croissant he'd smuggled from the bakery. We're partnered with Sweet Crumb for the food festival, Drew said, not even trying to hide his grin. You and the baker, together, planning a booth for 3 weeks. Jack's expression didn't change. His hand, however, paused mid-reach for his coffee cup, hovering in the air for one revealing second, before completing the motion with practiced ease. Fine, he said. Fine. Drew leaned forward. Jack, you've been crossing that street 3 times a day for weeks. You wore a pink apron on a Saturday, and now you're going to spend 3 weeks planning an event with this woman, and all you have to say is fine. Would you prefer I said splendid? Drew stared at him, then laughed, shaking his head. You are in so much trouble, my friend. The first planning meeting happened at the bakery after hours. Brianna had set up a small table near the window with notebooks, color swatches, and a plate of miniature pastries she told herself were for professional purposes, and not because she'd spent an extra hour making them look perfect. Jack arrived at 6 sharp. He'd come straight from the office, tie loosened, sleeves rolled to his forearms. He smelled like cedar and clean cotton, and when he pulled out a chair and sat down across from her, the small table suddenly felt very, very small. They argued about everything. The booth design. She wanted warmth, texture, wooden crates and soft lighting. He wanted clean lines, structure, something that looked engineered. She called his vision sterile. He called hers cluttered. She pushed a sketch toward him. He pushed it back with edits. Their fingers brushed over the paper. Neither acknowledged it. By the 3rd meeting, they'd found a middle ground that was, reluctantly, grudgingly, better than either of their original ideas. A booth that blended her warmth with his precision, rustic wood framing with clean architectural lines. Her pastries displayed on custom-built shelves he'd designed himself. It's not terrible, she admitted, studying the final sketch. High praise from you, he said. And there it was, that half-smile, the one that made the corner of his mouth lift and his eyes go soft in a way she was becoming dangerously familiar with. She looked away, bit her lip, focused on the sketch. It was during the 2nd week of planning that the chef arrived. His name was Ethan Moore, and he appeared in Sweet Crumb on a Thursday like a character from a different, less complicated story. Young, handsome in an approachable way, with kind eyes and an easy laugh. He was opening a farm-to-table restaurant 2 blocks over and had come to introduce himself to the neighborhood businesses. He tasted Brianna's salted caramel brownie, closed his eyes and said, "This is extraordinary. The salt balance is perfect. Did you use fleur de sel?" Brianna blinked. Most people just said yummy and moved on. Here was someone who understood the craft. "I did," she said, and something in her expression opened. The pride of being recognized by a peer. Ethan started coming back. Not every day, but often enough. He'd lean against the counter and discuss flavor profiles with genuine enthusiasm. He'd suggest pairings, her dark chocolate torte with his rosemary honey, her lemon curd with his lavender shortbread. He was complimentary in a way that was specific and intelligent, and he flirted with a gentle, respectful charm that never pushed too hard. He was, by every objective measure, a perfectly nice man, which is exactly what made Jack Clark lose his mind. It started subtly. Jack noticed Ethan the first time because the man was leaning against his spot at the counter, the section nearest the espresso machine where Jack always stood. A territorial irritation prickled under his skin, small and irrational and immediate. He said nothing, ordered his coffee, sat at a table instead of the counter, watched Ethan make Brianna laugh about something involving vanilla beans. The next day, Jack arrived at the bakery an hour earlier than usual. He didn't have a reason. He certainly didn't articulate one when Drew asked why he was leaving the office at 11. "Early lunch," Jack said. "You never take early lunch." "I'm evolving." By the end of the week, Jack had added a fourth daily visit to the bakery. Always casual. Always with a perfectly reasonable excuse. A question about the booth design. A detail about the festival layout. A comment about the weather that fooled absolutely no one. When Ethan was there, Jack sat closer to the counter, asked more questions, lingered longer over his coffee. His posture changed. Straighter, broader. A subtle physical expansion that Brianna might not have consciously noticed, but that her body registered like a shift in air pressure. Drew noticed. Drew noticed everything, because Drew had been watching this performance with the devoted attention of a sports commentator. "You went to the bakery 4 times yesterday," Drew said. 3. The last one was to finalize the booth signage. "You finalized the signage last week." Jack said nothing. Drew grinned. And across the street, standing at his post by the building entrance with a newspaper he'd stopped reading 20 minutes ago, Harold the doorman watched Jack cross the road for the 4th time that day. The older man folded his paper, tucked it under his arm, and waited. Jack was halfway across when Harold's calm, steady voice reached him. "If you keep this up, son, you'll wear out the soles of your shoes before you wear out your pride." Jack stopped mid-stride, turned. Harold gave him a look, patient, knowing, the kind of look that comes from 6 decades of watching people be foolish about love. Jack opened his mouth, closed it, straightened his tie, then caught himself doing it and dropped his hand. Harold chuckled softly and went back to his newspaper, and Jack stood in the middle of the street, realizing with sudden, uncomfortable clarity that the whole neighborhood could see what he was still trying to hide from himself. If you had asked Brianna Palmer when she first realized she was in trouble, she would have lied. She would have said something deflective, something about the festival being stressful and Jack being insufferable, and the whole situation being a logistical inconvenience she hadn't signed up for. But the truth, the quiet, stubborn, undeniable truth, had been building for days. In the way her heartbeat changed rhythm when the bakery bell chimed at certain hours. In the way she'd started wearing her hair down instead of pinned up, telling herself it was more comfortable, knowing it was something else entirely. In the way she caught herself smiling at nothing while piping frosting and realized she'd been replaying something he'd said that morning. The booth construction was nearly complete. 3 weeks of arguments and compromises and accidental touches had produced something genuinely beautiful, a structure that somehow looked like both of them, warm and precise, inviting and sharp. Jack had built the frame himself over 2 weekends, arriving at the festival grounds in jeans and work boots, sleeves pushed up, hands confident with tools in a way that was entirely different from his boardroom confidence. More raw, more real. Brianna had tried not to watch. She had failed spectacularly. The final night of setup fell on a Thursday. The festival opened Saturday. Most of the other businesses had finished their booths and gone home. The grounds were quiet except for the distant hum of the city and the occasional clatter of a stray vendor packing up. Brianna and Jack worked side by side, hanging the last decorations. String lights she'd chosen, warm gold, the kind that made everything look like a memory. He held the ladder steady while she climbed. She handed him ornaments while he reached for the high hooks. They moved around each other with the easy choreography of people who'd been doing this much longer than 3 weeks. The last piece was a small, hand-painted sign she'd made for the top of the booth. Sweet Crumb X Clark and Mitchell in her curving script. It needed to hang from a hook near the top of the frame, a spot she couldn't reach even from the ladder. She stretched. Her fingers brushed the hook, but couldn't grip it. She rose onto her toes, wobbled slightly, and made a small frustrated sound in her throat. "Here." His voice came from right behind her. She hadn't heard him move. Jack reached past her, his arm extending above her head, and hung the sign with one easy motion. But instead of stepping back, he stayed. His arm was still raised, his hand resting on the wooden frame above her, and he was close, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his chest, close enough that the scent of sawdust and cedar and something darker, something that was simply him, filled the space between them. Brianna turned slowly. Her back was almost against the booth frame. He was right there, looking down at her with an expression she'd never seen before. The teasing gone, the armor gone, just raw, unguarded intensity in those dark eyes. The string lights cast gold across his face. Somewhere in the distance, a car horn sounded and faded. The evening air was cool against her bare arms, but where he was close, everything was warm. He lifted his free hand, slowly, like he was giving her every chance to step away. His knuckles grazed her cheekbone, rough from the construction work, gentle in their pressure, and traced a line down to her jaw. She felt every ridge of his skin against hers. Her breath caught audibly in the quiet. "You drive me absolutely crazy," he said. Low. Almost a whisper, almost an accident, like the words had escaped without clearance. "You know that, right?" Her heart was hammering so hard, she was certain he could hear it. Her lips parted. Her voice came out barely above a breath. "I know. You do the same to me." Something broke in his expression, a wall falling, a decision made. He kissed her. It started slow, tentative, careful, as if he was asking a question with his mouth and waiting for the answer. His lips were warm and firm against hers, and for one suspended second, the world contracted to the precise point where they touched. She tasted coffee and something sweet, maybe the caramel from the sample he'd stolen earlier, and her hand found the front of his shirt and gripped the fabric without her permission. Then the answer came. She kissed him back, and the tentativeness shattered. His hand slid from her jaw to the back of her neck, fingers threading into her hair. She rose onto her toes, pressing closer, and her other hand landed against his chest where she could feel his heartbeat, rapid and unsteady, matching her own. The kiss deepened, turned urgent. His arm came down from the frame and wrapped around her waist, pulling her against him, and she made a small sound against his mouth that undid something fundamental in his composure. He kissed her like he'd been holding his breath for weeks and had finally been allowed to exhale. She kissed him like she was done pretending she didn't want exactly this. The string lights swayed above them in the breeze. The night air carried the faint scent of kettle corn from a vendor testing their equipment somewhere across the grounds. His thumb traced circles on the small of her back. Her fingers curled tighter in his shirt. When they finally separated, it was slow, reluctant, like pulling apart two magnets. Their foreheads rested together, both breathing hard, both slightly dazed. Brianna smiled first, a small, shy, embarrassed smile that she tried to hide by looking down. He saw it anyway. Jack laughed, a quiet, breathless sound, half wonder, half disbelief. He ran a hand through his hair, not for vanity this time, but because he genuinely didn't know what else to do with himself. Silence settled between them, not awkward, not empty, full, the kind of silence that holds everything that was just said without words. "I should close up," she murmured, still not stepping away. "I should go," he murmured back, also not moving. 10 seconds passed, maybe 15. The string lights hummed. A leaf skittered across the pavement nearby. Neither of them moved. Then she laughed, a soft, nervous exhale, and stepped back. He let her go, his hand trailing from her waist to her hip to empty air. "Good night, Jack. Good night, Brianna." She turned and walked toward her car, keys already in her hand. He watched her go, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the way she glanced back once quickly, as if checking that he was real. He was still standing there when her taillights disappeared around the corner. Jack Clark stood alone in the empty festival grounds, surrounded by half-assembled booths and golden string lights, and the lingering ghost of coconut shampoo, and pressed 2 fingers to his own lips, like a man trying to memorize something before it faded. Then he walked to his car, sat behind the wheel and didn't start the engine for a very long time. Across town, Brianna let herself into her apartment, dropped her keys on the counter, stood in the dark kitchen, and pressed her hands to her burning cheeks. She could still feel him, the roughness of his knuckles on her skin, the warmth of his mouth, the way his heart had raced under her palm. Proof, undeniable proof, that the man who seemed so impossibly composed was anything but. She closed her eyes, exhaled, and whispered to her empty kitchen, "Now what?" The kitchen didn't answer, but the question hung there, shimmering in the dark, waiting for a tomorrow that both of them were already afraid of. The days after the kiss were made of a different material, softer, warmer, charged with a current that hummed beneath every ordinary moment like music playing in another room. Brianna noticed it in the mornings, when Jack walked into Sweet Crumb and his eyes found hers before he even reached the counter. The look lasted half a second longer than before. Not much, but enough. Enough for her stomach to flip, enough for her hands to go clumsy around the espresso machine. Enough for Megan, who had developed a sixth sense for romantic developments, to narrow her eyes from her corner table and mouth the words, "I knew it." Jack noticed it in the afternoons, when he'd find excuses to lean against the counter instead of sitting at a table. His arm would rest near hers, not touching, almost touching. The space between their skin felt electric, like the air before a thunderstorm. She'd slide his coffee across the counter, and their fingers would brush, and neither of them would pull away quickly enough for it to be accidental. They didn't talk about the kiss, not directly, but everything they said carried the ghost of it. A new gentleness beneath the teasing, a warmth in the provocations that softened their edges. He still made comments about his own appearance. She still rolled her eyes. But now the eye rolls came with a smile she couldn't quite suppress, and his vanity had a tenderness to it, like he was performing for her specifically, hoping she'd laugh. She always did. Drew watched all of this with the fascination of a nature documentary narrator. "He brought her flowers yesterday," he told Nina during a coffee run, except he panicked and pretended they were for the booth decoration. She put them in a vase behind the register. "They're still there." Nina sipped her latte and said, "He also rearranged his entire Thursday schedule so his last meeting ends at 4 instead of 5. That's her slow hour. He thinks I haven't noticed. He's hopeless." Completely. They clinked cups. But here's the thing about fragile, unnamed things. They break more easily than the solid ones. The gossip started the way gossip always starts, with a grain of truth wrapped in assumption and seasoned with boredom. Someone on Harrington Street, a shop owner, a passing employee, a customer with too much free time, saw Jack crossing the street 4 times in one day. Someone else saw Brianna laughing at something he said, leaning toward him across the counter in a way that looked intimate. Someone put 2 and 2 together and got 17. The story mutated as it traveled. By the time it reached the flower shop 3 doors down, it had become, the baker girl was chasing the construction guy across the street. By the time it reached the dry cleaner, it had evolved into, she was completely obsessed, and he was just being polite. And by the time it landed, sharp and poisonous and wrapped in false sympathy, in Brianna's ears it sounded like this: "Oh, sweetie." The woman who owned the candle shop next door leaned against the bakery counter with an expression of practiced concern. "I just think someone should tell you. People are talking, they're saying you're, well, throwing yourself at him, and apparently he thinks it's funny. Laughs about it with his colleagues. I just didn't want you to be the last to know." Brianna's hands stopped moving. She was holding a piping bag over a row of eclairs, and the buttercream trembled, then went still as her grip tightened. "What?" she said. The word came out flat, controlled, but inside her chest something cracked like thin ice under a boot. "I'm sure it's nothing," the woman said, in the tone of someone who was sure it was everything. "He's a good-looking man, successful, probably used to the attention. You shouldn't feel bad. These things happen." The woman left. The bell above the door chimed, cheerful and oblivious. Brianna stood behind the counter, piping bag still raised, and felt the warmth of the past few days drain from her body like water from a broken cup. She thought about the kiss, the way he'd touched her cheek, the way his heart had raced under her hand. And then she thought, what if it meant nothing to him? What if she was the punchline of a joke she hadn't heard? What if the whole street was watching her make a fool of herself while he went back to his office and laughed? The shame was immediate, deep, the kind that burns from the inside out, that makes your skin feel too tight and your throat close up, and your eyes sting with something worse than sadness. Humiliation. She didn't cry. Brianna Palmer did not cry in her own bakery. Instead, She finished the eclairs with mechanical precision, washed her hands, dried them on her apron, and built a wall. It went up fast. She was good at walls. Years of independence, of doing everything herself, of protecting her dignity like it was the last thing she owned. All of it came rushing back, stacking bricks of composure between herself and the man across the street. When Jack walked in that afternoon, she greeted him with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Afternoon," she said. "The usual?" He paused. Something was off, and he felt it immediately, the way you feel a temperature drop before you see the clouds. Her voice was pleasant, professional, empty. "Everything okay?" he asked, leaning against the counter the way he always did. "Fine, just busy." She slid his coffee across the counter without looking up, without the lingering touch, without the half-smile she usually tried to hide. He frowned, tried a joke, something about the festival signage, a callback to an earlier argument. She responded with a short, courteous nod that felt like a door closing. He left confused. Came back the next morning. The wall was still there. He tried the teasing. She responded with cool professionalism. He tried sincerity, asked directly if something had happened. She said no, everything was fine, with a smile so perfectly composed it felt like a slap. "You're doing the thing," Megan told her that evening after closing. "What thing?" "The fortress thing. Where you decide you've been hurt and you build the Great Wall of Brianna, and nobody gets past it, including the people who didn't actually hurt you." Brianna scrubbed the counter harder. "You don't know what he did." "What did he do?" "He—" She stopped. The cloth went still, because the truth was he hadn't done anything. She'd heard a story from someone else about something he'd allegedly said to people she'd never spoken to. She hadn't asked him. She hadn't confronted him. She'd just believed it, because believing it was safer than being vulnerable enough to ask. But the wall was already built, and dismantling it felt more dangerous than keeping it up. Across the street, Jack sat in his dark office and stared at the bakery's lit windows. His coffee sat untouched on the desk, gone cold an hour ago. He replayed every conversation from the past 2 days, searching for the moment he'd lost her. He couldn't find it. And that was the worst part, the not knowing. The feeling of reaching for someone who was right there, right across the counter, close enough to touch and finding only glass. He picked up his phone, put it down, picked it up again. Drew's words from that morning echoed in his head. Just ask her what's wrong. But Jack Clark had spent his entire adult life solving problems through action, not words. He could build a building. He could close a deal. He could design a booth that made a woman's eyes light up. What he couldn't do, what terrified him more than any failed contract or impossible deadline, was say the simple, devastating truth that she mattered, that losing this, whatever this was, felt like losing something he hadn't even fully held yet. He turned off the light, went home, and for the first time in weeks didn't set his alarm early enough for the morning bakery run. The distance between them had never felt wider, or more wrong. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from choosing silence when your whole body is screaming to speak. Jack Clark knew it well. He'd worn it like a second skin his entire adult life, the ability to swallow what he felt, to redirect emotion into action, to fix things instead of saying things. It had served him in business. It had made him wealthy, respected, reliable. And now, standing on the wrong side of a wall he hadn't built and couldn't see, it was failing him completely. 3 days had passed since Brianna had gone cold. 3 days of polite smiles and short answers, and a distance that felt physical, like the air between them had solidified into something he couldn't push through. He still went to the bakery, twice a day now instead of 3, because the third visit had started to feel like begging, and Jack Clark did not beg, but he wanted to. That was the terrifying part. He wanted to cross the counter, take her hands and say whatever combination of words would bring back the woman who'd kissed him under string lights and whispered, "You do the same to me," with her heart in her voice. Instead, he ordered coffee, said thank you, left. It was Nina who saw the real damage. She watched her boss sit through a 40-minute budget review without turning a single page. She watched him stare at his phone during lunch, typing a message and deleting it, typing and deleting over and over, until he finally set the phone face down on his desk and pressed his palms flat against the surface, like a man trying to hold himself to the earth. She didn't say anything, not yet, but she started visiting Sweet Crumb more frequently. For the pastries, she told herself, though the pastries were only half the reason. The other half was the quiet, determined woman behind the counter, who looked like she hadn't slept properly in days and was holding herself together with discipline and sugar. Then the oven broke. It happened on a Monday morning, 6 days before the festival. Brianna turned the dial on the main oven, the big one, the workhorse that handled everything from her signature bread to the elaborate cakes that had started building her reputation, and heard a sound no baker ever wants to hear. A grinding, a click, then silence. She tried again. Nothing. Checked the gas line, the igniter, the thermostat, opened the back panel with hands that were steady from years of handling delicate things, and found the problem immediately. The heating element had cracked, a repair that required a specialized technician and a part that would cost more than her entire month's rent on the bakery space. Brianna closed the panel, sat on the kitchen floor, and for 30 seconds allowed herself to feel the full weight of everything. The broken oven, the festival looming, the business she'd poured every penny and every hour into, and the heartache she was carrying like a stone in her chest that she couldn't put down because putting it down would mean admitting it existed. Then she stood up, washed her hands, and started making phone calls. She called 4 repair companies. 2 couldn't come before Friday. 1 quoted a price that made her vision blur. The 4th offered a slight discount, but still landed far above what her thin budget could absorb. She calculated alternatives. The 2 smaller ovens in the back could handle basic orders, but not the festival volume. She could bake in shifts, start at 3 in the morning, work through the night. It would be brutal, but possible. Maybe. Megan came by that evening and found Brianna surrounded by spreadsheets, calculator in hand, mouth set in a line that meant she'd already decided to solve this alone and would fight anyone who suggested otherwise. "Let me lend you the money," Megan said. "No." I said no, I'll figure it out." Megan knew that tone. It was the tone that had gotten Brianna through culinary school on scholarships and side jobs, through the heartbreak of her first failed bakery location, through every moment when the world had suggested she wasn't enough, and she'd responded by working harder. It was the tone of a woman whose pride was both her greatest strength and her deepest wound. Nina found out on Wednesday. She'd come into the bakery for her usual afternoon latte and noticed the tension immediately. Brianna moving faster than usual, the smaller ovens running at full capacity, a tightness around her eyes that had nothing to do with the man across the street and everything to do with the fear of losing what she'd built. Nina asked casually how preparations for the festival were going. Brianna said fine. Nina noticed the oven wasn't on. Brianna said it was resting. Nina, who had spent 5 years as assistant to a man who hid his feelings behind action, recognized the deflection instantly. She went back to the office and walked into Jack's room without knocking. "Her main oven is broken," Nina said. "The big one. She's trying to handle festival prep with the small backup ovens and she looks like she hasn't slept in 2 days. Jack looked up from his desk. His face didn't change, but his hands went very still on the keyboard, the way they always did when something mattered more than he wanted it to. "How bad?" he asked. "The heating element is cracked. She needs a specialized repair and it's expensive. She won't ask anyone for help. You know that." He did know that. He knew it the way he knew the sound of her laugh and the way she wrinkled her nose and the exact shade of green her eyes turned when the afternoon light hit them through the bakery windows. He knew her pride. He knew her stubbornness. He knew that offering help directly would feel like pity, and pity was the one thing Brianna Palmer would never accept. So he didn't offer. He acted. That evening, from his office, Jack made 3 phone calls. The first was to a contractor who owed him a favor, a man whose company supplied commercial kitchen equipment to restaurants across the city. The second was to the equipment manufacturer directly, leveraging a business relationship his construction firm had maintained for years. The third was to the repair technician, arranging an appointment for Thursday morning. The invoice would read, "Complimentary service, manufacturer courtesy call." No mention of Jack, no mention of Clark and Mitchell. Just a routine quality check that happened to result in a full repair, free of charge. He hung up the phone, leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. This was what he knew how to do, not the words, not the vulnerable, terrifying act of saying, "I care about you and it's tearing me apart that you won't look at me the way you used to." But this, the quiet, invisible work of making someone's world a little less broken without asking for credit. Drew appeared in the doorway, coat on, ready to leave. He looked at Jack's face and the phone on the desk and understood immediately. "The oven?" Drew asked. "Don't tell her." Drew studied his friend, the tension in his jaw, the exhaustion around his eyes, the way his hand rested on the desk near his phone, like he was fighting the urge to call her directly. "You know," Drew said quietly, "at some point, fixing things in the dark stops being enough. At some point, you're going to have to just tell her." Jack didn't answer. Drew nodded, tapped the doorframe twice and left. The repair technician arrived at Sweet Crumb Thursday morning at 8. He introduced himself as a factory representative, conducting courtesy maintenance checks in the area. He examined the oven, replaced the heating element, tested every function and handed Brianna a form that said, "No charge, manufacturer warranty service." Brianna stared at the form, looked at the technician, looked at the oven, now humming with steady, beautiful heat. "This doesn't make sense," she said. "This oven is out of warranty." The technician shrugged with the ease of a man who'd been coached. "New policy, quality assurance program. You're lucky you were on the list." She didn't fully believe it. The timing was too convenient, the explanation too smooth. But the oven was working and the festival was in 5 days, and she was so exhausted that questioning a miracle felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. She turned the oven on, felt the heat rise, pressed her palms flat against the warm metal surface and closed her eyes. Outside, across the street, Harold the doorman stood at his post and watched the repair van pull away from Sweet Crumb. He'd seen Jack make the calls from the lobby phone the night before, when Jack thought no one was watching. Harold had said nothing then, and he said nothing now. He simply smiled the quiet smile of a man who understood that love, real love, sometimes looks like a fixed oven and a lie about a warranty. The thing about lies is they only survive in silence. The moment someone speaks up, the whole structure collapses like wet cardboard, and the person who finally spoke up was Nina Reeves on a Friday afternoon over a slice of raspberry cheesecake. It started innocently. Nina was sitting at her usual table at Sweet Crumb, the one near the window, where she could watch the street and pretend she wasn't keeping tabs on two emotionally stunted adults who refused to communicate like normal human beings. Megan was at the next table because Megan was always at the next table, and the two of them had developed an unlikely friendship built on shared exasperation and excellent pastries. "She's still doing it," Megan said, nodding toward the counter where Brianna was arranging macarons with the grim focus of a surgeon. "The Ice Queen routine. Won't tell me why. Just says she's fine, everything's fine, the world is fine. Meanwhile, she's baking at 3 in the morning and pretending she doesn't look at his office window every night before she locks up." Nina set down her fork. "She won't say what happened. Something about hearing that he doesn't take her seriously, that he laughs about her with people at work, that the whole thing is a joke to him." Megan's voice dropped. "It crushed her, Nina. The kiss meant everything to her, and she thinks it meant nothing to him." Nina went very still, the kind of still that comes before something decisive, the kind of still that people who knew Nina well had learned to recognize as dangerous, not in a loud way, but in the quiet, surgical way of a woman who collected information the way other people collected stamps, and who did not tolerate injustice. "That," Nina said, each word precise, "is the most absurd thing I have ever heard in my life." Megan blinked. "What?" "He doesn't laugh about her. He has never, not once, spoken about her disrespectfully to anyone." "I would know, and I sit 12 feet from his office door." Nina leaned forward. "Do you want to know what he actually does? He rearranged his entire weekly schedule so he could be here during her quiet hours. He kept the apron from that Saturday, the pink one, folded in his desk drawer like it's a relic. He turned down a dinner with the city's biggest real estate developer because, and I quote, he had a commitment. The commitment was coming here for a coffee and a slice of lemon cake before closing time." Megan's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "Last week," Nina continued, and now there was heat in her voice, the controlled fury of someone defending a truth that mattered. He sat through a presentation without hearing a single word because he was staring at his phone, trying to figure out what he'd done wrong. He hasn't slept properly in days. He looks at that bakery like it's the only building on the street that matters, and he looks at her like— Nina stopped, took a breath. Like she's the answer to a question he didn't know he was asking. Megan's eyes were glistening. Her hand was pressed flat against her chest. "Nina, whoever told her that story is either a liar or a fool," and she believed it without asking him, which means her pride is going to cost her the best thing that ever walked through that door. Silence. The bakery hummed with the soft sounds of the oven and the afternoon radio. Brianna was in the back kitchen, out of earshot, arranging pastries for tomorrow's festival prep. Megan stood up. "I'm telling her. Tell her everything, including the oven." Megan froze. "What about the oven?" Nina smiled, small, knowing. The smile of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. "The manufacturer courtesy repair. There's no such program. He called in a favor from a contractor. Arranged the whole thing from his office. Paid for the part himself. The technician was coached to say it was complimentary." Megan sat back down, then stood up again, then pressed both hands to her face and made a sound that was half sob, half laugh. "I'm going to need a minute," she whispered. "Take two. Then go tell her." Megan found Brianna in the back kitchen, elbow deep in fondant, murmuring measurements to herself. She stood in the doorway until Brianna looked up. "What?" Brianna asked, reading her friend's expression. "Why are you making that face? Who's getting married?" "Sit down." "I'm working." "Brianna Marie Palmer. Sit down." The full name. Brianna sat. Megan told her everything. Nina's words, nearly verbatim, the rearranged schedule, the apron in the drawer, the declined dinner, the sleepless nights. She told her about the oven, the phone calls, the favor, the coach technician. She told her about a man who didn't know how to say what he felt, so he showed it in every way he could think of, quietly, invisibly, asking for nothing in return. Brianna listened without interrupting. Her hands, still dusted with fondant, rested in her lap. Her face was very still, the kind of still that holds back a flood. When Megan finished, the kitchen was silent except for the hum of the repaired oven. The oven he'd fixed. Without telling her, without asking for gratitude, without using it as leverage to break through the wall she'd built, Brianna looked down at her hands. A single tear fell onto the fondant dust on her thumb. "I didn't ask him," she whispered. "I just believed it. I know. He fixed my oven, Megan. He fixed it and didn't say a word." "I know, honey." Brianna pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. The shame was different now. Not the burning humiliation of the gossip, but the deeper, quieter shame of having judged someone without giving them the chance to speak, of having built a wall against the one person who'd been trying, in his own silent way, to stand beside her. She stood up, untied her apron, washed her hands. "Where are you going?" Megan asked, though she already knew. Brianna looked at her with red-rimmed eyes, and a jaw set with the same determination she brought to every impossible recipe, every 3 a.m. baking session, every moment when the world told her she couldn't, and she answered by doing it anyway. "Across the street," she said, and for once Megan didn't say a single word. She just smiled through her own tears, pressed her hand to her heart, and watched her best friend walk out the door. The walk from Sweet Crumb to the front door of Clark & Mitchell Construction takes approximately 45 seconds. Brianna Palmer made it in 30, powered by adrenaline and regret, and the kind of courage that only shows up when you've run out of reasons to hide. The lobby was quiet. The receptionist had gone home. The building had that after-hours hush, fluorescent lights dimmed to half, the faint smell of cleaning solution mixing with the leather of the lobby furniture. Her sneakers squeaked against the marble floor, and the sound echoed in the empty space like a heartbeat. She took the elevator to the 7th floor. The doors opened to a dark hallway, every office closed except one, his. The light from his desk lamp spilled through the glass wall like a beacon, warm against the blue-grey dusk. He was sitting at his desk, jacket off, sleeves rolled, reading something on his laptop with the distracted frown of a man whose mind was elsewhere. His tie was loosened. His hair, for once, was slightly disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it. Not for vanity, for frustration. She knocked on the open door. He looked up, and the expression on his face when he saw her, surprise, then hope, then the careful suppression of both, made her chest ache in a way she would remember for the rest of her life. "Brianna." He stood, not quickly, but deliberately, the way he did everything. "Is everything okay?" She stepped into the office. The room smelled like him, cedar and ink, and the faint trace of espresso from a cup that sat cold on his desk. Blueprints were spread across the drafting table by the window. A framed photo of him and Drew at a construction site sat on the bookshelf. And there in the corner, half hidden behind a stack of files on his credenza, the edge of something pink and folded. The apron. She saw it, and her throat tightened so hard she almost couldn't speak. "Why did you fix the oven?" she asked. Her voice was steady. "Barely." Jack blinked. A micro pause, the kind that lasted a fraction of a second, but revealed everything. He recovered quickly, leaning against the edge of his desk with that practiced ease she knew so well. "If the bakery closed," he said, "where would I get my coffee?" It was the perfect deflection. Dry, casual, wrapped in humor like armor. 2 weeks ago she would have accepted it. She would have matched his tone, traded a quip, let both of them retreat to safe ground. Not tonight. "Jack." Her voice cracked on his name, just slightly. Just enough. His smile faded. The armor dropped. He stood there watching her with those dark eyes that saw everything, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked uncertain, not of himself, of whether she'd let him close enough for the truth to matter. "I believed something terrible about you," she said. "Someone told me you were laughing about me, about us, that none of it was real to you, that I was just—" She stopped, swallowed. "I believed it without asking you. I shut you out. And the whole time, you were fixing my oven and rearranging your schedule and keeping that stupid pink apron in your drawer like—" Her voice broke. She pressed her fingers to her lips. Her eyes were bright with tears. She was fighting with everything she had. Jack didn't move for a long moment. Then he pushed off the desk, walked around it and stopped in front of her. Close, not touching, just there, solid and warm and present in the way that had become as familiar as breathing. He raised his hand and cupped her face. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, slow, deliberate, achingly gentle. She leaned into his palm without deciding to. Her eyes closed. His hand was warm and rough and steady, and the feel of it against her skin dissolved something she'd been holding rigid for days. "I'm not good at saying what I feel," he said. His voice was low, stripped of its usual polish. "I never have been. But if you think I don't take this seriously, if you think for 1 second that you're not the first thing I think about when I wake up and the last thing on my mind before I fall asleep, then you haven't been paying attention." A tear escaped down her cheek. His thumb caught it. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should have asked you." "Yeah," he said. "You should have. No sugar-coating, no false comfort. Just honesty, delivered with a tenderness that made it land like a kiss instead of a blow." She laughed, wet, shaky, half a sob. "You're supposed to say it's okay." "It's not okay, it hurt." He paused, tilted her chin up so she had to look at him. "But I'd rather fight with you than have peace with anyone else. So here we are." She surged forward and kissed him. This kiss was nothing like the first. The first had been discovery. Tentative, wondering, careful. This one was urgent, desperate. The kind of kiss that says, "I almost lost you, and I'm not letting go." Her hands gripped the front of his shirt, pulling him closer, and his arms wrapped around her waist with a tightness that said he'd been waiting for exactly this, for days. For longer than days. Maybe since the moment she'd ruined that buttercream line and looked at him with fire in her eyes. He tasted like cold coffee and relief. She tasted like sugar and forgiveness. The kiss deepened, and his hand slid into her hair, and she made a soft sound against his mouth that made his composure crack, in a way no business deal or boardroom pressure ever had. When they finally pulled apart, foreheads touching, breath mingling, she whispered, half laughing, half crying, "You still have hours left on your apron shift, you know." He laughed against her lips. A real laugh, unguarded and warm, the kind she'd been missing like oxygen. "Put me back to work then. Saturday after the festival, 6 a.m., don't be late." "I'm never late." She smiled. He kissed her forehead, long, slow, a press of his lips against her skin that felt like a promise. She closed her eyes and breathed him in, and for the first time in days the tightness in her chest released. They stood like that in his quiet office, wrapped in lamplight and each other, while the city hummed below and the bakery glowed softly across the street. And across that street, standing at his post in the evening shadows, Harold watched the 7th-floor light and the two silhouettes close enough to be one. He folded his newspaper, tucked it under his arm, and smiled the knowing smile of a man who had seen this story before and had always known how this chapter would end. Saturday arrived the way good things sometimes do, bright and unexpected, as if the weather itself had decided to cooperate with a story that had taken long enough to get here. Harrington Street was transformed, Coloured banners stretched between lampposts. Music drifted from a stage at the far end, and the smell of a dozen different cuisines wove through the crowd like an invisible tapestry. Families wandered between booths. Children ran with cotton candy. The whole block hummed with the kind of energy that makes ordinary streets feel for one day like the centre of the world. The Sweet Crumb and Clark and Mitchell booth stood near the middle of it all. Warm wood framing with clean architectural lines, string lights glowing gold even in daylight, and Brianna's pastries arranged on the custom shelves Jack had built with his own hands. It was beautiful. It looked like both of them. They worked side by side all morning, and for the first time they didn't hide a thing. Jack's hand found the small of her back when they passed each other behind the counter. Brianna straightened the collar of his shirt without thinking, her fingers brushing his neck, and he closed his eyes for half a second, just long enough for Drew, standing 3 feet away, to pump his fist in silent victory. Megan cried, twice before noon. Once when Jack handed Brianna a coffee without being asked, and once when Brianna laughed at something, he whispered in her ear. A real laugh, full and bright, the kind that had been missing for days and sounded like sunlight returning after rain. Nina watched from behind a lemonade, satisfied. Harold waved from across the street with the calm pride of a man who had always known the ending. Even Ethan stopped by. He tasted a salted caramel brownie, complimented Brianna's technique with genuine warmth, and shook Jack's hand with the easy grace of a man who had never been the villain and knew it. Jack shook back, firmly, but without the territorial stiffness that had marked their earlier encounters. Progress. The booth sold out by 4 o'clock. Every pastry, every sample, every last crumb. Brianna stood behind the empty display and laughed in disbelief. Jack pulled her into a hug right there, in the middle of the festival, in front of everyone, I guess, and she let him. Her arms wrapped around his waist, her face pressed against his chest, and she breathed in the scent of him, mixed with sugar and warm wood, and the particular sweetness of a day that had gone exactly right. The festival wound down as evening settled. Vendors packed up. The music softened. The crowd thinned until the street was quiet again, lit by the remaining string lights and the amber glow of storefronts closing for the night. They walked back to Sweet Crumb together. Brianna unlocked the door, and they stepped inside, just the two of them, surrounded by the warm ghosts of vanilla and butter, the kitchen still radiating heat from a full day of baking. She turned on only the small light above the stove. The bakery glowed soft and golden, like the inside of a lantern. He leaned against the counter. She stood in front of him, and the air between them, which had spent weeks cycling through tension and teasing and distance and forgiveness, finally went still. Perfectly, completely still. He reached for her hand, drew her closer. His thumb traced slow circles on her wrist, and she could feel her own pulse jumping beneath his touch. "Hi?" he said softly. "Hi," she whispered back. He kissed her. Gently at first. Her forehead, her cheekbone, the corner of her mouth. Each kiss was deliberate, unhurried, as if he was memorizing every part of her face with his lips. She trembled, not from cold, from the overwhelming tenderness of being held by someone who touched her like she was precious and wanted, and entirely enough. When his mouth finally found hers, the kiss was slow and deep, tasting of caramel and the quiet certainty of two people who had stopped running. Her fingers traced the line of his jaw. His hands cradled her face like something sacred. What followed was gentle and intimate, and theirs alone, built on every provocation, every coffee, every look that lasted too long, every silence that said more than words. And in the quiet afterward, wrapped in each other in the soft kitchen light, Brianna pressed her lips to his shoulder and whispered, "Worth the wait." He pulled her closer and murmured into her hair, "Worth everything." Some mornings arrive already knowing they'll matter. The Tuesday after the festival was one of those mornings, ordinary on the surface, extraordinary underneath, the way all the best moments tend to be. Brianna was behind the counter at Sweet Crumb, decorating a 3-tier vanilla cake for a retirement party. The morning light came through the front windows at a low angle, turning the flour dust in the air into tiny floating stars. The radio played something soft. She was murmuring to herself, a habit she'd stopped being embarrassed about, since the only person who heard her these days found it endearing rather than strange. Things had changed since the festival. Not dramatically, not with fireworks or grand announcements, more like a season shifting, gradual, inevitable, warm. Jack still crossed the street 3 times a day. He still leaned against the counter with that particular tilt of his shoulders. He still made comments about his own appearance that made her roll her eyes. But now, when he arrived, he kissed her cheek before ordering. Now, her hand lingered on his when she passed him his coffee. Now, when the bakery was quiet, he'd come around the counter, stand behind her while she worked, and rest his chin on the top of her head in a way that made Megan, who witnessed it once, produce a sound only dogs should have been able to hear. The teasing hadn't stopped. If anything, it had evolved. He told her that her frosting technique was adequate at best. She told him his construction company was a decent little hobby. He pretended to be offended. She pretended not to notice the way his eyes went soft when she laughed. Drew called them the most exhausting couple in the Western Hemisphere. Nina said they were annoyingly perfect and should be studied by science. Harold simply nodded when he saw them together, with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose patience had been rewarded. But Jack hadn't said it yet. The real thing. The words that sat behind every joke and every gesture and every kiss, heavy and true and terrifying in their simplicity. He hadn't said it because Jack Clark had spent 34 years mastering the art of control, of keeping the important things locked in a vault where they couldn't be damaged or rejected or used against him. Saying, "I love you," meant handing someone a key to a room he'd never let anyone enter. It meant being vulnerable in a way that no contract or negotiation had ever required, but the vault was full, overflowing, and every time she looked at him with those green eyes, laughing or teasing or quietly serious, he felt the lock straining. It happened on that Tuesday morning without planning, without rehearsal. He walked into Sweet Crumb at 8:15, same as always. She was focused on the cake, piping bag moving in precise spirals, nose wrinkled in that way that meant she was chasing perfection. A smudge of vanilla frosting decorated her left cheekbone. Her hair was pulled back but losing the fight, a few strands falling loose around her face. She didn't look up when the bell chimed. She knew it was him. She always knew. He sat on his usual stool, watched her work. The morning light caught the frosting on her cheek and turned it golden, and the lock broke. "I tried not to fall in love with you," he said. Her hand stopped. The piping bag hovered motionless above the cake. She looked up, slowly, carefully, the way you look at something you're afraid might disappear if you move too fast. His eyes were fixed on her. No humor in them, no deflection, just raw, steady, unguarded truth. "I want you to know that I tried," he continued. "I told myself it was just coffee, just cake, just a woman with a sharp tongue and flour on her face who happened to work across the street." He paused. "I failed miserably, but I tried." Brianna set the piping bag down. Her eyes were shining, full and bright, and her lower lip trembled in a way she couldn't control and didn't try to. "I tried too," she said. Her voice came out thick with emotion. "You are absolutely impossible, Jack Clark." He stood, walked around the counter, stopped in front of her, close enough to see the tears balanced on her lashes, close enough to smell vanilla and sugar and everything that meant her. He kissed her forehead, long and slow, his lips warm against her skin, his hands gentle on her arms. "Impossible," he murmured against her hair, "is my best talent." She laughed through her tears and buried her face in his chest. His arms closed around her, steady, certain. The arms of a man who had finally stopped running from the one thing he couldn't build, couldn't buy, couldn't control. And in the warm, flour-dusted quiet of Sweet Crumb, with the morning light pouring golden through the windows and a half-finished cake waiting patiently on the counter, two people who had spent weeks pretending they weren't falling finally admitted they'd already landed. Months passed the way happy months do, quickly, warmly, stitched together with small rituals that became sacred without anyone declaring them so. Jack still crossed the street 3 times a day. Brianna still rolled her eyes when he checked his reflection in the display case. Drew still called them exhausting. Megan still cried at least once a week over something they did that she found unbearably romantic. Nina kept a running mental file of their most ridiculous moments, which she shared with Harold during her afternoon walks past his post, and which Harold received with his usual quiet amusement. The bakery thrived. The festival had put Sweet Crumb on the map, and orders poured in. Custom cakes, catering requests, a feature in the local food magazine that Brianna read 7 times and pretended she'd only read once. Jack built her new shelves for the expanded display. She created a salted caramel brownie she quietly named the Clark on the recipe card, though it never appeared on the menu under that name. Some things were just for them. They fought sometimes, about his habit of solving her problems without asking, about her habit of refusing help until she was drowning, about whose turn it was to lock up, and whether his espresso order counted as a real meal, and whether the display case was for pastries or personal grooming. The fights were brief, honest, and always ended the same way, with one of them laughing first and the other pretending to still be angry for approximately 4 more seconds before giving in. It was a Thursday evening when everything changed again. Brianna was closing up. The bakery was empty, the counters wiped, the ovens cooling. She was untying her apron when the bell above the door chimed. Jack walked in carrying a white cake box, the kind sweet crumb used for custom orders. She frowned. "I didn't make a delivery today. This one's incoming, not outgoing." He set the box on the counter. "A customer placed a special order. I'm just the delivery guy." She looked at him. He looked back with an expression she couldn't quite read. Calm on the surface, but underneath something electric. His jaw was tight. His hands resting on the counter were perfectly still in the way they only got when he was holding himself together. And he was wearing an apron. The pink one. The same powder-pink sweet crumb apron from the bet, slightly faded now, tied with careful precision over his dress shirt. Her breath caught. "Open the box," he said. She lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of white tissue paper, sat a small velvet box. Navy blue. The kind that only holds one thing. Her hands flew to her mouth. Jack came around the counter, stood in front of her, took the velvet box and opened it. A simple diamond ring, elegant and perfect, catching the last of the evening light. "You told me once that I needed to put my feet on the ground," he said. His voice was steady, but his eyes, those dark, intense eyes that had read her from the very first day, were shining. "Both my feet are on the ground right now, Brianna, and both of them are pointing at you." She laughed. The kind of laugh that comes tangled with tears, messy and beautiful and completely uncontrollable. Her vision blurred. Her chest ached with a fullness she didn't have words for. "Yes," she said, before he could finish asking, before the question had fully formed. "Yes, absolutely yes." He slid the ring onto her finger. His hands trembled, just barely, just enough for her to feel it. She grabbed his face with both hands and kissed him, tasting salt from her own tears and the smile he couldn't contain. When they pulled apart, she looked down at the apron and laughed again, wiping her eyes. "You kept it," she whispered. "I keep everything that matters." She pressed her forehead against his chest, his arms wrapped around her, and the bakery held them the way it always had, warm, sweet, and full of the scent of everything good. 1 year later, Harrington Street looked exactly the same and completely different. Sweet Crumb had expanded into the adjacent storefront, a second room with larger ovens, more counter space, and a cozy seating area that Megan had personally decorated with mismatched chairs and fresh flowers every Monday. The chalkboard menu now filled an entire wall, written in Brianna's curving script, and the line on Saturday mornings stretched to the sidewalk. Clark and Mitchell Construction still occupied the building across the street. The 7th floor office still glowed late into the evening when deadlines pressed. Drew still ate croissants at his desk and blamed the crumbs on clients. Nina still ran everything with quiet, terrifying efficiency. Harold still stood at his post by the entrance, a little grayer, a little slower, same knowing eyes. And every morning, at 8:15, the bell above Sweet Crumb's door chimed. On this particular morning, a bright Tuesday in October, the kind of morning that smells like turning leaves and fresh bread, Brianna was behind the counter, arranging a tray of cinnamon rolls. Her apron was tied high, resting above the round curve of her belly. 6 months along now. The baby kicked when she bent over the oven, as if personally offended by the angle, and she'd taken to talking to the bump the way she used to talk to her pastries, soft murmured instructions and gentle negotiations. The bell chimed. Jack walked in, suit sharp, hair perfect, wedding band catching the morning light on his left hand. He paused at the display case, leaned toward the glass, and adjusted his hair in the reflection with slow, deliberate precision. On purpose. Absolutely on purpose. Brianna watched him from behind the register. She pressed her lips together. Her eyes narrowed. The familiar exasperation rose in her chest like an old song she knew every word to. "Good morning," he said, straightening up with that smile, The same crooked, infuriating, beautiful smile from the very first day. Am I still the most handsome man who's walked in here today? She crossed her arms above her belly. The bakery's been open for 2 hours. 14 people have come through that door. And Mr. Henderson from the bookshop brought his golden retriever. So you're second. Jack placed a hand over his heart. Wounded. You'll survive. He leaned across the counter. She leaned in to meet him, not because she'd decided to, but because some things had become as natural as breathing. He kissed her, soft and warm, tasting like toothpaste, and the particular contentment of a man who had everything he'd ever wanted and knew it. How's the little one? He murmured against her lips, his hand finding her belly with the gentleness he reserved for exactly 2 things in life, her and the life they'd made together. Active, kicked through my entire morning prep. I think we're raising a baker. Or an architect. The kicking could be structural criticism. She laughed. He grinned. And for a moment they stood like that, forehead to forehead across the counter, his palm warm on her belly, the morning light turning everything gold. Drew appeared in the doorway, cinnamon roll already in hand. Are you two going to be disgusting all morning, or can I order a coffee? Both, Jack said without looking away from Brianna. Megan arrived next, immediately burst into tears at the sight of them, and had to be consoled with a lemon scone. Nina walked in precisely at 8:30, nodded approvingly at the scene, and ordered her usual latte with the calm satisfaction of a woman who had orchestrated more of this love story than anyone would ever fully appreciate. And outside, in the gentle October light, Harold folded his newspaper, watched the bakery windows fill with the warmth of people who belonged to each other, and smiled. The street was the same. The routine was the same. The provocations, the eye rolls, the laughter, all the same. But now there was a ring on his finger and a ring on hers. Now there was a life growing between them, built on buttercream arguments and fixed ovens and a pink apron folded in a desk drawer. Now the story had weight and roots and a future stretching forward like a road they'd walk together, teasing each other every single step of the way. Brianna looked at her husband across the counter of the bakery she'd built with her own hands, in the neighborhood that had become home, and felt the kind of happiness that doesn't shout, the kind that hums, steady, warm, certain, like an oven set to the perfect temperature, filling a room with the promise of something wonderful about to be ready. Are you going to put your feet on the ground, she said, or do you want coffee first? Jack smiled, the real smile, the one that was only ever hers. Both, he said, always both. Leave your comment and share this story with someone special. It truly helps us keep bringing new stories to you. And if you want to follow every chapter of this emotional journey, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Your support makes all the difference.